Thank you all for joining us for this 2020 Transgender Day of Remembrance event. This event is being hosted by Clackamas County Queers and Allies Employee Resource Group. My name is Brooke Gelfand, and my preferred pronouns are she, her, hers. Since we're gathered together, we would like to start with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that the land on which we gather and occupy in Clackamas County rests on the traditional village sites of the Molalla, Kalapuya, and Clackamas tribes. The larger area also rests on the traditional village sites of the Multnomah, Wascow, Cowlitz, Cathlamet, bands of Chinook, and many other tribes who made their homes along the Columbia and Willamette rivers, creating communities and summer encampments to harvest and use the plentiful natural resources here. Many of the descendants of these tribes are members of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. We take this opportunity to thank the original caretakers of this land. Today we're in community to memorialize transgender and gender diverse people who were killed in the US in the past year. This year, 53 people are being remembered. Due to misgendering and dead naming by reporting authorities, it is likely that this number is an underrepresentation. Dead naming is the act of referring to a transgender person by their birth name instead of their chosen name. You will see that there's a disproportionate number of those being remembered who are Black and women of color. Today we will be saying their names, seeing their faces, and hearing about their deaths. We do this to acknowledge the injustice done to them and to bring awareness of an epidemic of violence that appears to be accelerating. We do this to hold vigil and honor people who lived their truth. Kelly, could you read the first name?
Absolutely. Thank you, Brooke. Corbin Ray Bach. Corbin was a U.S. Army medic and a corrections officer in his civilian life in Kentucky. He is survived by his wife, Amber, and their 3 children, Cadence, John, and Sheffield. Corbin endured relentless bullying and completed suicide on October 6, 2019. He was only 23 years old.
Christine Zephyr. Christine went missing on August 27th, and her body was found in the woods by a hunter on October 10th, 2019. Christine's cause of death is still under investigation by Minnesota's Blue County Sheriff's Department. Christine's death was widely reported using her dead name and incorrect gender. She was 23 years old.
Daphne Dorman. Daphne was a San Francisco-based comedian, actress, and transgender activist. She completed suicide on October 11th, 2019. Her family, friends, and fans are heartbroken and say she had the most beautiful soul in the world. She was 44 years old.
Brianna B.B. Hill. B.B. was fatally shot at 11:30 a.m. on October 14th, 2019 in Kansas City, Missouri. Her murderer stayed on the scene and was arrested on site by law enforcement. Just a few months before BB was beaten by officers responding to an incident at a local salon. She was significantly injured, and the officers were charged with excessive force after the assault was caught on video by a community member. She was 30 years old.
Nikki Kuhnhausen was murdered by a 25-year-old man she met after he found out that she was born male. Her skeletal remains were found on December 7th, 2019, on or around Larch Mountain in Washington State. She was strangled to death. Media and law enforcement coverage of her death used her dead name and frequently referenced her lifestyle as a trans woman. She was only 17 years old.
Angel. Angel was a talented artist living in the Washington, D.C. area. She was last seen by her friends as she left for a date on December 10th, 2019. Later that evening, she was reported to be gurgling and struggling to breathe by someone in Hyattsville, Maryland, via a 911 call. Despite life-saving efforts made by the residents and paramedics, Angel died that evening. She was 21 years old.
Alice Carter, Baby Alice. Baby Alice was well-known and widely liked member of the DC street community. She was kicked out of her family home at age 20 when she came out as trans. On December 18th, 2019, her friends found her unresponsive and rushed her to the hospital, where she later died. Her cause of death has not been reported. She was 35 years old.
Yahira Nesby. Yahira was an incredible ballroom dancer and drag performer that lived in Brooklyn, New York. At around 4 p.m. on December 19th, 2019, Yahira was shot and killed in her own home. Paramedics were not able to revive Yahira when they arrived at the scene. She was 33 years old.
Mia Penny. Mia was found dead in an abandoned building in the Washington, D.C. area on December 29th, 2019. The details of her death are not clear, but she was shot in the midsection and appears to have died from her wounds. Her family and the media use her dead name and incorrect pronouns in reports of her life and death. She was 26 years old.
Dustin Parker. Dustin was a taxi company co-founder. Dustin was a taxi company co-founder in Oklahoma. He was shot and killed while providing free rides home to New Year's partygoers on January 1st, 2020. Dustin was a co-founder of the Oklahomans for Equality McAllister chapter. Dustin is survived by his wife, Regina, and his 4 children. He was 25 years old.
Emerald Kelleher. Emerald was a volunteer, advocate, and animal lover who lived in Montgomery, Alabama. She loved to sing and act and wasn't willing to compromise who she was for others. After her beloved companion dog Zorro died in 2019, she began to lose hope. Emerald completed suicide at Zorro's grave on January 3rd, 2020. She was 31 years old.
Alex McCrae. Alex was a quiet but powerful trailblazer for the transgender community. He lived in St. Louis, Missouri, and won multiple awards for his advocacy to advance the rights of trans individuals in schools. Alex was pursuing a social work degree at Fontbonne University at the time of his death. Alex completed suicide on January 4, 2020. He was only 22 years old.
Camilla Maria Concepcion. Camilla was a Los Angeles-based Yale graduate and a TV writer. She was a staff writer for Daybreak and for the new Netflix show Gentified. Camilla's colleagues said that she was talented, beautiful, and a joy to work with. She worked hard to increase access to Hollywood careers for the trans community, and Camilla completed suicide on February 21st, 2020. She was 28 years old.
John Scott DeVore, Scotland Kelly DeVore. John Scotland was a gender fluid person who lived in Augusta, Georgia. They were strangled to death in March 2020 by a local man after the man and his wife robbed John Scotland's home. Their murder Their murderer is awaiting trial in Georgia, and John Scotland's family continue to search for their loved one's remains. John Scotland was 51 years old.
Monica Diamond. Monica was a business owner, a founder of a nonprofit, a chosen mother to many, and a beloved friend in Charlotte, North Carolina. On March 18th, 2020, Monica was being treated in an ambulance for shortness of breath when a man burst into the vehicle and fatally shot her and only her. The medic and witness on the scene were left unharmed. She was 34 years old.
Lexi Sutton, known to many as Ebony. Lexi was a resident of New York, known for her love of fashion, poetry, and makeup. Lexi died on March 28, 2020, on the edge of a Harlem playground. She died from massive blood loss after her throat was cut by an unknown attacker. Witnesses say she was violently attacked and tried to get away, but wasn't able to. No arrests have been made. Lexi was 33 years old.
Lorena Borjas was a prolific mother of the transgender Latinx community in the Queens area of New York City. She turned her home into an HIV testing clinic when trans women needed a safe place to be tested. She bailed out trans women who had inappropriately been jailed for prostitution. Her community was devastated that they could not protect her from dying from COVID on March 30th of this year. She was 59 years old.
Ashley Moore. Ashley was a chef who lived in Newark, New Jersey. She died on April 1st, 2020, outside of a housing program she lived in Newark, New Jersey. Her body was cremated without a complete autopsy, but the medical examiner reported many horrific, disfiguring injuries on and to her body. Her cause of death is still categorized as pending. She was 26 years old.
Henrietta Robinson. Henrietta Robinson was a renowned figure in Miami's LGBT+ community and was nicknamed Grand Lady and Mother of Miami Beach. She was celebrated as one of the first transgender people to live openly in Florida and was a fixture in the nightlife community and drag queen fashion shows. She underwent surgery at Mount Sinai Medical Center, where she contracted COVID-19 and died on April 3rd. She was 59 years old.
Johanna Metzger. Johanna was a musician and college graduate from Pennsylvania. At the time of her death, she was living in Baltimore. She was stabbed to death on April 11th, 2020 in Baltimore. The rest of the circumstances of her death are not known. Her age is unknown.
Nina Pop. Nina worked at a fast food restaurant and was described by a friend as always happy. She was stabbed to death in her own apartment in Sikeston, Missouri on May 3rd, 2020. She was 28 years old.
Haley J. O'Regan. Haley has been described as a proud trans woman who embraced her identity. Haley was stabbed in the barbershop where she worked in San Antonio, Texas on May 6th. She was 20 years old.
Jane Thompson. Jane was shot and killed by a police officer in Orchard Mesa, Colorado, during what appears to have been a mental health crisis. Jane's gender identity was not recognized for weeks, and she was misgendered and dead named in initial reports and news articles regarding the incident. She was 33 years old.
Tony McDade. Tony McDade was shot and killed by a named white police officer in Tallahassee, Florida on May 27, 2020. Tony was 38.
Selena Reyes Hernandez. On May 31st, 2020, Selena Reyes Hernandez was shot by a man who went home with her after she told him that she was transgender. Even though she was dead already, he later returned to shoot her again. Selena was 37.
Name unknown. On June 6, 2020, the body of an unidentified person was found in an abandoned building in Chicago. Their gender presentation suggests that they were identified as a trans woman. She was believed to be between the ages of 16 and 20.
Dominique Remy Fels. Dominique had a passion for fashion design and loved to give fashion tips to her mom, who was her best friend. Dominique was stabbed and dismembered in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania on June 9th, 2020. Dominique was 27 years old.
Raya Milton. Raya was shot and killed in a robbery in Cincinnati, Ohio on June 9th, 2020. Local authorities and media misgendered and deadnamed Raya. Her sister Ariel said, "Seeing the news completely deadname and misgender my sister was like seeing someone just wipe her existence clean away." Raya was 28 years old.
Brian Powers. Brian, who sometimes went by the name Egypt, was known as a proud advocate for the LGBTQ community. He enjoyed cooking, old movies, and meeting new people. On June 13th, 2020, Brian was shot in front of a church in Akron, Ohio. Brian was 43 years old.
Brayla Stone. On June 25th, 2020, Brayla Stone was found shot dead in a vehicle near the walking path in Sherwood, Arkansas. Brayla's family requested that the vigil attendees and news outlets use her dead name following her murder. Brayla was only 17 years old.
Drea McCarty. Drea was found dead on June 30th, 2020 in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, amidst an epidemic of violence against Black trans women in the USA. The circumstances and cause of death have not been reported. Drea was 32 years old.
Mercy Mack. Mercy was found at 6:15 a.m. on June 30th, the final day of Pride Month. She was found unconscious and with gunshot wounds in the parking lot of an apartment complex after neighbors had reported hearing gunfire. She died at the scene. Mercy was only 22 years old.
Tatiana Hall, 22 years old. Tatiana Hall was a Black transgender woman whose favorite color was purple. She was found dead in Philadelphia, PA, sometime around June 29th. Very little is known about what happened to her, possibly due to the dead naming by the police and media. And Tatiana was only 22 years old.
Shaki Peters. Shaki Peters was a performance artist who was active in community organizing in the New Orleans area. She was found shot dead on July 1st near the town of Amite City in southeast Louisiana. She was 32 years old.
Bree Black. Bree was found with gunshot wounds near her home after police responded to a reported shooting. She died at the scene. Her murderer has not been found. She was 27 years old.
Summer Taylor. Summer Taylor worked at a veterinary clinic and was an activist in Seattle. They died after being hit by a car which was driven at speed into Black Lives Matter protesters. They were 24 years old. Bless you, Summer.
Angela Martinez Gomez. Angela Martinez Gomez died of COVID-19 after being forced to continue working at a Burger King in Santa Monica, California while ill. Managers had refused to allow her to take time off sick and blamed hormone injections for her illness. After her death, other staff walked out, citing inadequate safety protocols. Angela was 42 years old.
Marilyn Monroe Cazares. Marilyn loved to sing and dance and had a flair for fashion. She was found dead in an abandoned building after first responders answered a fire call in the early hours of July 13th. According to her family, she had been stabbed and her body burned. She loved to sing and dance. She was just 22 years old.
Tiffany Harris, Dior H. Ova. Tiffany was originally from Kingston, Jamaica, and lived in the Bronx, New York. She was fatally stabbed in the chest in New York City's Bronx borough on July 26th of this year. Tiffany was dead named and misgendered by some other news outlets. Tiffany was 32 years old.
Quisha Hardy. Quisha was a stylist who operated a popular hair salon in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. On July 27th, she was fatally shot and left to die on a neighborhood street. She was the third Black trans woman killed in Louisiana in 2020. Quisha was 24 years old.
Aja Raquel Roan Spears, or Rocky Roan. Aja owned a boutique clothing line and volunteered at a local nonprofit where she helped kids transition out of foster care. Her family reported that, having been bullied and attacked her whole life, she was a source of joy for others and always helped those in need. On July 28, 2020, Aja was one of two people stabbed at a vigil for a victim of a shooting in Portland, Oregon. Aja was 32 years old.
Janelle Ariana Briscoe. Janelle was known to be a kind, sweet soul. She completed suicide on August 7th, 2020. It was unexpected and very sudden. She was only 23 years old.
Key Sam. Key Sam was found unresponsive and suffering from a gunshot wound in a hotel room in Lafayette, Louisiana. She died from her injuries on August 13th. She was dead named in the media. She was 24 years old.
Shelley Lynn Rose. Shelley loved music and was a hopeless romantic and artist. She dreamed of opening a cafe one day to create a place where everyone felt welcome. Her family was transphobic and unsupportive, and she endured bullying at her workplace where she was a waitress. Shelley died by suicide on August 26th. She was only 16 years old.
Leah Rayshawn Day. Leah was wrongfully jailed by a transphobic judge in Cuyahoga County Jail, Ohio. She was found unresponsive in her cell on August 30th, 2020. When Leah's mother picked up her daughter's things, she found a letter describing the terrible conditions in the jail. Her death spotlights the intersectionality of racism, transphobia, poverty, and mass incarceration. She was 28 years old.
Rukia Isis Beamer. Rukia was a young woman who lived in the Cleveland area. She was described by her friends as a beautiful soul who loved nature, music, and magic. Rukia was known as a pioneer for the LGBTQ community of Lakewood, the area of Cleveland where she lived. Rukia completed suicide on August 30th of 2020. She was just 22 years old.
Ellie Che. Ellie was a young woman from Georgia who loved fashion and travel. She wanted to feel safe as she transitioned and set New York as her destination. Ellie moved to New York City in late July. On August 31st, 2020, she was found unresponsive on a beach in the Bronx. Media and her autopsy used her dead name to report on her death, which was officially classified as a drowning. She was 23 years old.
Isabella Mia Lofton. Isabella was a young woman from Chicago. Despite experiencing unrelenting transphobia all of her life, she was sweet to everyone. Isabella died on September 7th, 2020, while spending a weekend with a friend in New York. She was found unresponsive by first responders behind her friend's apartment building, partially clothed and wrapped in a tarp. She was 21 years old.
Gia Valentina Romaldo Rodriguez. Gia was a confident woman, originally from Mexico. She had recently obtained asylum in the US and participated in outreach to others in the trans community of New York City where she lived. Gia traveled to Miami for a medical procedure related to her transition. She died during the procedure, which took place on September 15th, 2020. She was 46 years old.
Arian Burnett. Arian lived in Kansas City and was adored by her family and community, who described her as a goddess. Her body was found in a grassy area next to a road, shot to death on September 19th, 2020. Arian's best friend, who was also transgender, was murdered in the same place and in the same way in 2011. Her loss has devastated many in her community. She was 37 years old.
Mia Green. Mia was a well-liked young woman from Philadelphia. She died on September 28, 2020, from multiple gunshot wounds. While her longtime boyfriend seemed concerned about her wellness at first, it was later discovered that he was responsible for her murder. The reason for her murder is still unknown. Mia was 29 years old.
Emily Nicole Brown. Emily was known in her community of Covington, Georgia, for being an advocate for the trans community. Emily's family turned their back on her when she came out as trans in 2018. Despite this, she was often the first person to take young trans folks shopping for clothes that matched their gender identity. She completed suicide on April 20th, 2020. Emily was 25 years old. And stick with me because I'm doing the next one too. Back. Oliver Sasser. Oliver was a young man from Georgia. He was studying biology and ecology at Augusta University at the time of his death. It is reported that he died at his parents' home from unknown causes. His death was only recently made known by a friend of Oliver's due to his family dead naming him in reports and to the media. Oliver was 21 years old.
And I'm going to get the closing here. Just a moment, folks. All right. I just want to note that this year, the transgender community has been hit hard by COVID-19, as they are more likely to experience higher levels of poverty, homelessness, unemployment, and have less access to healthcare and often lack familial support. These factors make the community very vulnerable to long and short-term health risks associated with COVID-19. So most of the closing remarks that I'm going to do have been modified from the writing of Corey Timmons, who is an artist and a designer, and her work draws from pop culture, social justice, family systems, and crossing the gender lines. We're here to pay our respects to life's cut short, beautiful souls taken in brutal acts of violence, suicides in response to the hatred they endured. Some were killed by intimate partners or people they knew, others by strangers, and some at the hands of police. There have been far too many names on this list, and even one is a tragedy. For many of us, we hear our own vulnerability in those names, or we're here as allies, perhaps because a loved one, a friend, a colleague falls into this fragile category of the queer community, or just because we passionately believe in equality. Regardless, the list reminds us about the fragility of human life, our own mortality rendered in names and locations. And now, to be blunt, I must say that many of us are not the ones facing the risks of violence to the same degree. The intersection of race, class, and gender create disproportionate violence against trans feminine people of color in particular. Even well-meaning queer folk have excluded the needs of trans and or people of color for the sake of the greater good since the beginning of the gay rights movement, whitewashing history and silencing the trans feminine women of color who essentially founded the movement. I will say this clearly and unequivocally, we must vow to protect the most vulnerable among us, even when we feel vulnerable ourselves. We can no longer settle for the rights of many at the expense of the few. It is incumbent on us to show that we understand the disproportionate risk of violence, the privilege that each of us holds, and the power we must have to make meaningful change. Remember that none of us are truly liberated until we're all liberated. We need to stand with our trans family. They need your support now more than ever. And we have strength of courage, love, resilience, and community all with us today. All of you have done that just by showing up. So in closing, I just want to say for those who feel the most at risk, knowing that allies and fellow LGBTQ people are here gives us hope. And in these times of darkness, remember that there are people in this community who love you, support you, and care deeply about your ability to live your life without fear of violence. It is unfortunate that we have so few opportunities to gather, and yet here we are. So don't remember to celebrate life, to experience the joy that self-determination allows, and to revel within the light within. Channel the anger, the fear, the frustration, or whatever emotion you might be feeling as fuel to make positive change. It is time we rightfully reassert our place as leaders, caretakers, and catalysts for change. Because through our experiences, we see the plurality and the beauty of the human experience, the joy of self-expression, and the empowerment of standing strong in the face of violence. We can help form a world where someday we won't need to come together to mourn, instead, only to celebrate. Thank you for making our community safer for all.